Welcome back to the M&A Guy Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Franco, founder and CEO of Meritage Partners, and more recently, author of my first book, The Inevitable Exit. In this book, I talk to founders and entrepreneurs about the 7 value drivers of their company on how they can not only build strong income, but a strong outcome through the inevitable exit. So get your copy. Hope you learn from it. Hope it provokes some thought with you. But coming back to today's episode, I'm excited about this one. This is one every founder and CEO and investors out there need to hear, because leadership isn't just about outcomes. It's ultimately about clarity, culture, and the energy behind them. My guest, Julian Guderley, a globally recognized executive coach, keynote speaker, and leadership advisor to high growth companies, private equity leaders, and mission-driven organizations. Julian, thanks for being here with me. How you doing?
Brian, it's great to be here. What a fantastic intro. Thank you. It's great.
Thank you. Is there anything I missed?
No, man. I mean, you said it really well. I mean, in short, I help founders grow, scale their revenue and their company so that it leads to, your book, to the inevitable exit, which is always kind of going to happen somewhere down the road. But in order to get there, right, at the beginning, people either raise money or find their way into the market, and then they scale their revenue. But what a lot of people miss is how to create systems that stick, and how to create teams and culture that allows the right people in the right seat and people to thrive with each other. Too many companies, and I'm sure you know that, it's just a convoluted mess of relationships that that won't actually lead to a successful exit, or that will lead to something that feels more like a headache than it feels like that significant moment in someone's journey. And so that's what I love to do, and that's what I love to specialize on.
I really appreciate that, because often I talk about how, this is part of the company or the organization that is very important to the continuity of any organization, any company, any operation, is the people, the culture, and the systems that they subscribe to. And if you don't have those in place, scaling becomes more of a exercise of futility, becomes a headache, it becomes difficult. And so to see you working at this capacity is very encouraging and very exciting to see. So I want to kind of unpack a lot of this just through some questions that I prepared. And so the audience knows we do not rehearse these, we do not script these. We want to just have you sit in.
Bring them on.
Yeah, as a fly on the wall and listen into the conversation. So Julian, thanks for the enthusiasm. Let's talk about culture and performance in mergers and acquisitions. So in the work that you do, we often say, financials get deals done, right? Because financials is something that investors can subscribe to, analyze, they can understand, they can illustrate, they can articulate. But leadership and culture is what makes it last. So from your vantage point as a coach, as a cultural advisor, how does culture become a multiplier in terms of valuation as related to a process?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think as you're saying it, the financials get the deal done. They're the foundation, right? If you don't have solid financials, or you're not driving your revenue year after year, it's going to be really hard to scale. It's going to be really hard to exit. But usually what happens is somewhere along the line, you really have to understand, am I bringing A players onto the bus? And how do they fit together? Like a big puzzle piece, right? That could be, a question of cultural background. That could be a question of ambition. It could be a question of, do we have a similar worldview? But when the right people sit in the right positions, that's when teams excel. That's when kind of that cherry on top happens year after year, because it's ultimately people that drive any business, no matter which industry. And so I think it comes back down to hiring values aligned, right? You can teach skill, but you can't really change will, if that makes sense.
It does.
So the willpower that someone brings on board, and their ability to put their willpower into the mission that's being driven, it really matters. And so I think will also really relates back to values. And so, what I help people understand and what I advise on is to hire people that fit the values bill, that fit with their willpower, and obviously that also have the skill. The good news is, if they didn't have the skill, you could still teach them that. right? That's up to you or your leadership again, in the way you run your organization, the way onboarding functions. Now, in the best case, though, you're hitting always in the skill and in the kind of willpower category. It's like a very easy way to kind of understand it, right? Most people, though, they hire out of urgency. And so that's another really important piece to understand. Like, yes, business happens today, it happens in the here and now, but most life scenarios are not as urgent as our mind wants us to think. What happens if you actually, take a breath, maybe take that reflective moment and understand, who do I really want on that seat? What would be my best case hire? What would be an addition to the team I already have? And so those are the things that most founders, like, yes, intellectually we understand that. It's not that hard to talk about that, but to actually do it and to embody it and to lead this way, yeah, that's usually where we differentiate between companies that go all the way and that go there, kind of collected, and companies that just run from one problem into the next. And usually, Brian, and I'm sure you know this, you can hear it in the stories the founder tells you. So if there's always another reason, if there's always another person, if there's always another circumstance, always another weather event that your business is dependent on, it's likely that you're actually not leading the team in systems that work for your financials and systems that work for your culture.
You're right. You and I were recently working on a case study that we'll keep confidential, but these two partners in a business that, one of the partners wants to exit and the other wants to continue and grow and scale. We found, and we often hear this though, CEOs, they get burnt out, and or CEOs, they become wealthy with monetarily, but they become poor in time, and so they're trying to balance out life, and they're trying to create a lifestyle that is fitting for their life circumstance, whether they're married and family or not. But when we think about that, they've done everything right. They've done everything right from the standpoint of growing and scaling the business. They've done everything right from the standpoint of getting to that size and to that scale. That's going to attract investors to want to acquire their businesses, to further that vision and to ultimately 10x what they've built. My question there is, how have you seen burnout, or how have you seen the lack of clarity in leadership and ownership impact the company itself?
I mean, it's like the number one thing that actually impacts companies negatively, right? Is when the founder, the leader, has a form of fatigue, or, burnout is a big buzzword, but you can just even call it fatigue, right? The moment that you're kind of spinning the same wheel over and over again, usually you can personally recognize there's some kind of resistance. And the other side of that, in your building years, in your growth stage years, when you're building that flywheel, you feel like you're in a flow state, right? Or you should feel like you're in a flow state, at least some part of the year, right? You're meeting the right people, you're knowing the right thing to say to your clients, you're hiring the right staff. And so when you're on the other side of that and you feel like every day is just a drag, or, oh man, what does this person want from me? It's kind of the number one pain point, is when you're in that situation where your reaction is, you have a short fuse and like, oh man, what does that person want from me? Then you notice, I'm getting shorter breath, or I'm fatigued, or I'm closer to burnout than maybe I was before. And so usually what it does, it makes leaders irritable. And when you're irritable, you talk to your staff not like you're leading them, but like you need them to do exactly what you want them to do. And don't get me wrong, like, obviously, if you're running a company, there's an amount of control that goes with it. But I happen to believe that, the larger part of all of it, we can't control. There's a healthy amount of faith and a healthy amount of surrender that goes into it. And that can only work when the founder, the visionary, the leader of a pack is relaxed enough to know, hey, I hired the right people. We've trained them right. I'm in touch with all the decision makers. Let me actually step back, right? To the example you made, like, it's one of those founder experiences where the founder wants a specific deal to happen, but maybe the deal doesn't want to happen in the timeline that the founder has in mind. And so I'm sure all of us have experienced this before, where sometimes things happen exactly as you want them to happen, and other times they don't. And so when they don't, what are you going to do? And so you want to really kind of relax and reflect and make sure you have someone else that can take the lead for that time. Like in any sports team, there's usually not one leader, but a team of leaders that take turns when to run, when to stop, when to break, when to pause. I'm not sure if I answered your question accurately, but that's what comes up for me.
No, you did. You really touched on the entire topic because, when we think about, I like how you framed it as fatigue. It certainly is, right? But I often too remind founders and owners is that when they come to a point where they want to exit their business, we typically find if they're young enough and have enough runway ahead of them, they actually get very excited about the opportunity of an M&A transaction, because really what they're selling, and I remind them, is they're selling the things they no longer want to do in the business, or they're burnt out or they're fatigued with the way they've been operating the business, and perhaps they've hit this glass ceiling, or perhaps they're up, they're down, they're up, they're down, and they can't find a way to take out that lumpiness in their revenue stream. It could be lack of people or good people. It could be processes. It could be equipment. It could be whatever, depending on what industry they're servicing or what industry they're in. But I do like the way you put that, because if you can show individuals and stakeholders of these companies a way to continue to grow and scale their legacy, the businesses that they've started, and allow them to do that with less heartache and less headache, and the ability to grow at a much faster pace with a larger strategic investor or a financial investor, it gets them very excited. And so I do like the way you framed it. And I do like the way you answered it, because with this type of opportunity, just like the case study you and I were working on, if there's a way to get to a certain intended destination sooner with a playbook that allows them to access a valuation higher than what they could have done on their own, it gives purpose, and it's very encouraging, for those to understand that. So I do like the way you framed that response.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, it's also very personal achievement or moment for anyone to go through, right? Is this, I've worked the last 10 years, I've worked the last 15 years. So once you put this exciting kind of carrot in front of people, usually all of the emotions come up, right? And it's like, oh man, I've worked on this forever, so let's get there as quick as possible. But this is maybe one of those mystery bubbles to pop. No one ever has had an overnight success. And I'm sure that with the right playbook, with the right steps, you can get in the right lane, and that lane will then inevitably lead to an exit that makes your moment significant. But is there really urgency? And again, like we live in a culture where we've been trained through social media and our cell phones and whatever other apps we use, that we have these short kind of attention spans that have this fight or flight reaction. A founder, a leader that can lead a 20 people, a 50 people, a 200 people team, that person wants to become forged and resilient to those kind of short-term inputs. And so if you exit 3 months down the road or 12 months down the road, it makes a difference, but it's a marginal difference. And so having that longevity, having that breath, having that cadence of realizing, okay, this might be a little longer of a journey than I thought, on top of my last 10 years, on top of my last 15 years of even getting here. I think that's what differentiates founders from either going down the fatigue or burnout route, where it's like, it needs to happen quickly, and if it doesn't, I'm disappointed. If it doesn't, I feel stuck. Or founders that are like, okay, well, things always kind of come different than I planned them. Now, am I able to adjust to how things actually show up? Can I deal with this turn in the market or this new opportunity? And so those aren't hard skills that everyone can just learn from a book. Those are kind of like rolling with the punches, right? Like everyone has to find their growth in real life opportunities and moments. And you can do that in business, but you could also even do that while traveling or while raising a family, because that's where this principle of life, that nothing really entirely comes the exact way you thought it's going to come, is going to show itself to you. And your resilience is either going to grow, or you're going to, just kind of fold your cards at those opportunities.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Well, so I want to dive into another question I noted for us, and let me frame it for you, because it's really in and around the theme of redefining success, and I think in an M&A transaction. And so you touched on a couple of those points, but often, in the narrative of A, it's always maximize the valuation, maximize the number, maximize the cash for many of our clients, right? But when you start to work intimately with these clients on the details of the transaction, it's more than just the financial outcome, like I was describing earlier, right? If there's a way to remove points of friction in the business, and a lot of times by way of having access to capital that's not the founder's own personal checkbook, right? It allows them to think differently, allows them to behave differently, because they can come to their business with that clarity that they need to drive the business, right? So with that framing, with that thought process, how do you help in your work? How do you help founders and executives redefine success in that way, and in a way that really honors both their legacy and, we always ask, if you're gonna exit, which we all inevitably will, what are you exiting into? What does that look like? So how do you help founders and executives define that success?
Yeah, I like the question you ask, which is what are you exiting into, right? So, and your question to me, how do I help people with it? I think it starts with asking really deep questions or different questions than they might be exposed to in the day-to-day of their business, right? And so for me, true success, if you were to picture like a wheel, kind of like the picture behind me here, or like a pizza with 8 slices, right? It would be, well-being, and it would be freedom that really defines success to me. And so let's do 4 slices on well-being. That's mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. Mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. And then on freedom, it's, the 4 freedoms: money, time, relationships, and purpose, right? Money, time, relationships, and purpose. So that makes like a slice of 8, right? Or 8 slices to the pizza. And so if you were to just self-assess 0 to 10, how am I doing on that today? And then ideally you've done it 2 years ago and you're like, 2 years ago, I did horrible at this. And now I've grown in this, or maybe I only did it today for the first time. And you realize, oh, wow, look at that. Spiritual is like a 3. What does that even mean to me, right? Or maybe relationships is a 2 because you're going through a tough time in your intimate relationships, or you dislike the people that you have to work with, but that's just how it's gone, And people often don't talk about this, but we don't have full control over every single piece of that. Again, there's a lot of surrender to life if we go deeper in the layers here, but we do have deliberate choice, and we can make some really good choices about who we pull closer and we build and cultivate relationships with, or who we, kind of politely just find a new chapter with. And so that's my first question usually, like, how do you even define success? What are your metrics for well-being? What are your metrics for freedom? Because, anyone I've ever met, no matter if they had $1 billion on their bank account or $1 on their bank account, well-being and freedom is what we all look for. You could call it the pursuit of happiness. It's all kind of in a similar direction, well-being and freedom, right? And so that's one layer to kind of understand conceptually. How am I scoring on that? How is my score change over time? And then your question of like, what are you exiting into? I mean, kind of across this industry, right? People define this usually as your first mountain and your second mountain. Your first mountain is your company for most people. So you're going to climb that first mountain. You're at the peak of that first mountain. The peak is usually when you're hoping to exit. And ideally, your financials are good. You got a great advisor. You have, the right company you're doing this with. So you're going to land in your target zone. If you're lucky, you're not greedy, and you're just going to feel really, really good about it because you feel like you've got the right support in your corner. But then the jump from your first mountain to your second mountain is not from peak to peak. So I want you to visualize that with me, right? Like one mountain, what's in the middle? There's a valley, second mountain. So you don't jump from one peak to the next peak. You have to go back down from the first mountain. So let's say you exit. Let's say you're transitioning from being the CEO visionary into being an advisor. Let's say you have a second bite of the apple 3 years later. That's all great. That's all kind of how that works, right? But you'll individually, personally, with your values, with the world you want to build for your children, for your family, for the next decades of your life, you'll have to climb down that first mountain. And in that valley of the first mountain, before you go up the second mountain, if that's another company, or if that's legacy, if that's a family property, if that's, you name it, whatever dream you have, right, you will have to go through an identity, like a refining process of your identity. I was about to say an identity crisis. Well, not for everyone, it has to be a crisis, but there has to be some form of, oh boy, look at that. Mountain one is behind me. Here I am in the valley. Well, who am I without this company? Who am I without this role, right? And so those are the questions that they sound really simple, but they really will take us deeper. Who am I? And what am I doing all this for in the first place? Especially if you have, a 7 and 8 and 9 figure amount of dollars in your bank account. Like, what are you doing all this for? What are you picturing? What's your heart's desire, right? What's your children's desire? What would be your children's desire? And do you have systems, structure, and support in your corner of people that can make that real with you? And for most people, to be very honest with you, and I know you know this really well, it's just a bunch of question marks when you start with that. Because they're still like at the ascent of the first mountain. They're like, yeah, dude, I don't have time for this. We just got to drive revenue, man. Every dollar counts. I got to get my EBITDA up, and I'm going to have to get my costs down. And it's like, sure, that's not incorrect. But if you're not asking yourself who you're becoming in the valley for your second mountain, and if you don't know who's in your support team, you're very likely going to suffer. And that suffering, in the best case, is going to inform who you become. In the worst case, it's going to be a shit show. And so that's what a lot of people do go through.
No, I really appreciate your insight on that, because, this is where you live, and in terms of guiding and advising, founders and entrepreneurs. As we come to an end of this episode together, Julian, I'd love to hear, some parting advice that you could leave for founders who are, maybe they're feeling the weight of leadership. Maybe they're considering a future exit or a capital partner. What would you tell them?
Yeah, what I would say to anyone really is the number one freedom that I've heard from all of my clients, all of my guests at events, anytime I've been at an event and listening to people on stage, or when I met people of ultra net worth, the kind of deca billionaire plus club, everyone, it doesn't matter who you are. What matters are your relationships. Do you have relationships that you feel like you have a direct line to the people that matter to you? Mm-hmm. Or do you have relationships where you talk about people that aren't in the room? And so it might sound really simple, but I would always start there, is what are the relationships I actually want to live, right? The shortest advice would be stop talking shit. Just zip exactly. It. Don't talk shit about others, because no high performer does that, right? We don't have time for that. We accept circumstances the way they are, and then we move on. But also, and this is part of the relationship freedom, don't do this in your own head, because we all have a narrator. We all have an inner voice, and the narrator might be like, what's this guy Julian talking about? Or like, Brian, what office are you sitting in? This looks way too good for a podcast studio, right? Whatever the narrator says, that's not really who we are. It comes back to the question, who am I? What kind of relationships do I cultivate? And so, just to kind of bridge it back to where we started this conversation, it's very relevant for your bottom line, for your revenue, for how you lead your teams to scale your revenue. Mm-hmm. That's always going to be a part of growing a business. I don't want this to be misunderstood. It's not like there's a bunch of like hard facts and then there's touchy-feely things. A lot of people still operate in that polarity. To be honest, that to me is super old school. You kind of got to up your game a little bit, It's always both. You got to have solid P&L. You got to really understand your revenue. You got to understand your teams and how they perform and how they fit together. And you also have to do an amount of inner work that allows you to cultivate well-being and freedom, and specifically relationship freedom with yourself, with others, and then ultimately with your legacy. And so let me ask a question back to you if we have time for that.
Please.
When you hear the word relationship freedom and legacy, like, what lights up for you? What are the relationships you pull closer in your life to build a legacy that you want to leave?
So I immediately went to a case I was working on a couple of years ago, and it really helped me define the answer to this question. And it was a gentleman, very, very successful in a manufacturing business. He sacrificed a lot of his time, and part of that sacrifice was not enough time with his family. And when we went to work with him and to sell his company, he was sharing some very personal stories with me of, how in some of the developmental years of his son's life, he wasn't there because he was working. And, fast forward in time, what had happened is that son of his ended up developing substance abuses and went through a very tough patch of road in his life. And so the immense amount of guilt that this client felt for missing out on that moment in time. And of course, he couldn't help but to think, like, what if I did something different with my time? What if I spent that time with my son? What would have been the outcome of his journey had he intervened more? And so when I think about relationships, I immediately think about family. When I think about friendships, I think about, where are we spending our time? I mean, I enjoy the work that we do. In fact, I mean, I love it so much, I don't call it work because I enjoy it with the people that I serve with. And, but when I think about, where am I poor in my life today? I think time. Like, I wish I had more time, but I do have time. I have the same amount of time every day, just how am I utilizing that time? And so the freedom from, a calendar allows for the time to spend with those that you want to nurture those relationships with. For me, it's my wife and my kids and my friendships. And so that's what it means to me. Of course, the monetary value of owning a company can help you fulfill some, but not all of those expectations. But of the time that I spend here on earth and in business, this is what I've learned along the way.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah. No,
and your
thank
son
you.
is part of your company, no?
Yeah, he's been working with us since interning in high school. So
It's a great example of how to bring some of those relationships close in, what you just called it. You didn't say another word than work, but the pursuit of work and play, I guess. Just the expansion of your impact and your skill in the world. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. Well, Julian, thanks for that thought-provoking question and spending the time sharing your wisdom and your experiences. We're going to leave some show notes for people to reach out to you if they want to connect and learn more about how you could help them in their organizations and in their companies. But Julian, again, thank you so much for the time spent with us today and just sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Brian, for having me on.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for listening in to this episode of the M&A Guy Podcast. If you like what you're learning, what you're hearing, please subscribe to our show and we'll see you on our weekly episodes. And also, if you're a founder, stakeholder, thinking about scaling, a succession plan, or preparing for an exit, we invite you to join Meritage Partners at one of our in-person or virtual events. You can find us at meritage.partners and sign up for one of those events there. And don't forget, newly launched and released book, The Inevitable Exit. If you haven't read it, what you are going to read is a playbook, is a guide of all the transactions that I've worked on over the last 23 years. And I've distilled those into 7 value drivers that stakeholders and business owners like you should be focused on. But again, thank you for joining us and listening in. I'm your host, Brian Franco. This has been another episode of the M&A Guy.